So I don't know whether people are still finding their way into the bowels of this institution. It's always difficult in the MC building. So let's see whether there are more that are coming, but we don't have much time, so let's get started. I am Hans-Peter Lankes. I'm with ODI as Managing Director. I have a past in this institution, and so I have the honor of moderating this panel about private sector innovation in fragile contexts. And just kind of a couple of words up front from me. It's sort of interesting when fragile contexts are not sort of the environments that your credit officers would dream of, and the question always arises, what is actually feasible? Is there anything happening in fragile environments? Well, the interesting feature is that, of course, the private sector is very active because people have to make a living in many different ways. And the private sector almost certainly dominates in all fragile settings in terms of employment, in terms of the commerce that's taking place, in terms of small scale production. So the private sector is there in fragile settings. So the question is, how do we connect to that private sector? Is that how do we ensure that the private sector can grow? How best to do that in these complex environments? And that's what we will be talking about today. It is about connecting, of course. The DFI community has a history of operating in FCV environments. IFC has a very long history of engaging. Other DFIs have a history of engaging, but it's been difficult to grow that engagement. There's a commitment. There's a general commitment, for instance, in the IFC, a commitment to shareholders to very significantly grow the engagement in fragile contexts. And it's, I think, fair to say that it's been very difficult to do that. So let's hear a little bit about that. What is it that makes it so hard to grow private sector engagement in fragile settings? Let's also hear about the experience that private sector enterprises have in FCV contexts. And let's hear about what we can learn from the experience so far about best ways of engaging innovation in financial instruments. How effective has it been to blend, to use blended finance instruments, the role of capacity building, other factors that go into operating in these environments. And we have a fantastic panel for that. Let me start on the left with Nancy Lee, who is Director of the Sustainable Development Finance Program at CGD, a think tank in Washington. We have Jean-François Péan, who is Senior Investment Manager with Bamboo Capital and responsible for Haiti. And Bamboo Capital, of course, is an organization that is operating in many other countries as well, and very successfully so. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. We have Barthoud van Slingeland, who is the managing partner of XSML Capital, operating in a variety of African fragile and conflict environments. And again, want to hear from you. You are both clients of IFC. And on my right, I have Aisha Williams, who is the Director for Blended Finance and Partnerships team at the IFC, overlooking, among others, the IDA private sector window, which is one of the key instruments that IFC has given itself to operate in fragile and conflict settings. So we have a great lineup here. And what I would like to do is just have a couple of questions for each of our panelists to start out, and then we will turn to the floor to Q&A. So let me start with Nancy in trying to get us a bit of a overall picture. So Nancy, could you help to set the stage? Talk a little bit about the context that we're operating in fragility and conflict settings, the status of DFI, private sector financing in fragile countries. Tell us a bit about what you think the scenario is at this point.
Thanks so much, Hans-Peter. I'm really delighted. I guess I'll take this. Can everyone hear? I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. I will take the role that you laid out. I thought to start us off, it would be useful to look at innovation inside the MDBs, and particularly, obviously, the World Bank Group, and not just innovation at the transaction level, but innovation at the business model and operational level. So let's take, for example, IFC 3.0. This pioneering approach of major innovation that's really aimed at building private markets. It embodies the whole of bank approach, so it encompasses cascade of principles for allocating public finance, the aim impact scoring mechanism, country private sector diagnostics, and concessional finance, including from the IDA PSW. So this seems like a good moment to think about how the whole of bank approach works for fragile and conflict-affected states. And I wanted to focus here on one key dimension of the whole of bank approach, which is private sector diagnostics and investment climate reforms that are included in country partnerships. If any of you looked at the Global Economic Prospects report that was recently released, you saw a very interesting analysis of the drivers of investment acceleration. And to summarize, it basically said comprehensive reform agendas are more powerful than individual country-specific reforms. So we're talking about macro reforms, institutional reforms, structural reforms. And it said that high-quality institutions are extremely important in driving high probabilities of success. So now let's relate that to fragile and conflict-affected states. Those things, macro stability, structural reform, institutional strength, are exactly what are in short supply in fragile states. So the question is, how should the bank engage on the reform side with those institutions? So we at CGD are undertaking a sort of review of country partnership frameworks for fragile and conflicted states. We have here Songdao Duan, who's working with me on this. And we've just taken a look at those country partnership frameworks for 16 conflict states and 13 fragile states. Those are the ones that are actually public, so people outside the institutions have access. And we're asking 4 basic questions. Is promoting private sector development and investment a focus of those country partnership frameworks? To what degree are relevant macro, institutional, and structural reforms supported? Are there differences between fragile states and conflict states in their country partnership frameworks? And are key reforms underrepresented? Now, to do this analysis, we sort of created a reform typology. So it has macro stability, budget and debt management. It has institutional strength related to things like utilities and regulatory frameworks. And then it has a bunch of enabling environment kinds of measures, what used to be called doing business. So barriers to entry, cross-border trade, dispute resolution, business insolvency, paying taxes, access to infrastructure services, financial services. So we have a big matrix, and we assess reforms across those dimensions. We're not finished yet, but I thought this would be a great opportunity to just give you some early results of our research. So the first thing we found was that all of the CPFs have promoting private sector investment as an area of focus. So you might think that in fragile and conflicted states, those kinds of reforms would take a second seat to other kinds of reforms that are more urgent. That's not what we found in the country partnership frameworks, which makes a lot of sense because for governments that are either weak or distracted by conflict, the role of the private sector becomes particularly important in promoting growth, creating jobs, and even providing services. So big private sector focus. Macroeconomic stability, budget, and debt management is consistently an important focus as well. More than 90% of country partnership frameworks for conflict-affected states target those kinds of reforms. The percentages for fragile states are also high, not quite as high, 70 and 92% respectively. For structural reforms, they are also a focus for both sets of countries, but some structural reforms are less targeted than others, particularly paying taxes, cross-border trade, dispute resolution, and bankruptcy are a focus in less than half of the country partnership frameworks for fragile states. And then finally, the drivers of investment accelerations, which includes trade and strong institutions, and I would add digital access as a kind of cross-sectoral important enabler. The picture is more mixed. There's less of a focus on cross-border trade and less of a focus on stronger utilities and regulatory bodies, at least for fragile states. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the results is, interestingly, the content of investment climate-related reform is actually higher in conflict states than it is in fragile states, which we were a little surprised about. We thought in conflict states, lots of other things would push out those kinds of reforms, but those reforms are actually better represented in conflict states than fragile states. As we were having a conversation before this meeting, and it may be something like in conflict states there's a kind of break in governance, and there's an enhanced resolve and will on the part of kind of new governments to solve some of these fundamental problems. So let me just end by saying, what does all this tell us? It tells us first that the bank is trying to make whole of bank approaches relevant in fragile and conflict-affected states. Whether the bank is actually effective in driving reform and actual private investment is, of course, a separate question, and I think that's the next step in our research. We're going to start looking at the program evaluations, the partnership framework evaluations, to see what the results are. And I would also observe that these, having gone through these CPFs, they have a huge range of objectives and indicators, and one has to ask whether reform agendas of this breadth are realistic for fragile states, and more fundamentally, how do we define success, since the probability of meeting all the reform objectives is not very high. So let me just end with a question, which I think we should ask ourselves. Should the bank be working with fragile and conflicted states on economy-wide enabling environments, or should it work with governments to prioritize a few sectors, a few critical sectors, and the reforms that are directly related to enabling private investment in those particular sectors? I'm not sure what the answer is, although I would tend toward the latter, but I would say that the World Bank Group, that there is no institution better placed to bring the knowledge and the evidence to bear to answer that question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And I will come back to you later with a bit of a question on what the picture is in terms of the investment obstacles, whether you've seen that in your... So we've heard what the bank or the bank group wants to address in these countries. Does that fairly reflect the nature of the obstacles? Or is that more differentiated? But let me first go to Aisha with a question. Aisha, within this context, IFC has been growing. I think IFC is the largest DFI source of DFI finance in in fragile and conflict settings. What's your experience? You're trying to grow that business. I mentioned that earlier. What are the obstacles to that? Is the either private sector window, these instruments that you've given yourself, useful? What is your point of view there?
Thanks very much, Hans-Peter. You know, I was looking at my notes for this session, and it started off by saying that IFC, while we are the largest, that historically we were not very active in fragile and conflict-affected environments, and I think that there was this perception, wrongly, as you said, that the private sector can't thrive in the midst of conflict. I mean, in terms of the development world, conflict requires humanitarian assistance, not private sector investment or expertise. That being said, the first three investments, when I joined IFC around 20 years ago, and the first three investments that I did as a young investment officer in the TMT, the telecom and media practice, were in Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and they were quite profitable. So, if I do say so myself, so that it belies the point that yes, the private sector can definitely thrive in conflict and fragile environments, and in fact, the private sector may end up being the dominant source not only of economic activity but of service provision in these type of contexts. So the question for us becomes, how do we support this? How do we support the activity that is already taking place? So as Hans-Peter mentioned, IFC had undertook a major strategic shift back in 2018 at the time that we also received additional funding from our shareholders. And really, as part of that additional funding, we made a commitment to fundamentally shift our business model and achieve much larger share of our business in IDA and FCS contexts, around 40% by 2030, but also looking specifically at the poorest and most vulnerable countries. We made a commitment to achieve around 15 to 18% of our business in those countries by 2030. What have we gotten right, and where do we still need to make progress? What have we gotten right? I think first, an understanding of the need to shift towards project development and not just project finance has been quite important. These are not environments where you wait for a project to come to you that is already fully well structured and put together and just seeking financing. No, these are projects where you need to work with teams to help design and build the engagement, the market. So the shift towards upstream and project development has been important. Two, actually having staff working on the ground in these countries has been also critical. Again, I think one of the most important things to be able to work in an FCV context is to actually understand the very nature of that FCV context. Who are the players that you can engage with? Who are the players you can't engage with? You know, how do companies work around the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis? So that's number two. Number three, I think blended finance has been extremely helpful, and it's, you know, I love blended finance. It's my department, but it's part of an entire, let's say, it's part of an entire continuum or ecosystem of financing, development financing that is needed to support these markets, from humanitarian assistance to World Bank development policy aid to IFC advisory and upstream support, and ultimately to blended finance, which is a very targeted tool and limited insofar as its intent is to help projects that are on the cusp of bankability to achieve to address the market failures that are preventing bankability and thus be viable. The ultimate objective of blended finance, the theory of the case, is that ultimately, if it works over time, it won't be needed, right? Because a market will exist.
And this is the local private sector for
this is the local private
Most
sector.
part.
But it was my fourth thing with what we did well is working with the local private sector, is engaging the local private sector, even as we, because I think as you said in our pre-meeting, we will all get very old waiting for the Citibanks of the world to come into many of these markets. So engaging with the local private sector is key. What have we not done well? So let me toot our horn. So between 2018 and 20,
and this is completely entre nous.
yes, okay,
Chatham House, don't worry.
Please, let's just get between us. What have we not done well? Oh, well, first, so between 2018 and 2023, just to give you some numbers, our annual IFC's annual commitment volume I'm using as a proxy PSW eligible. So these are amongst the poorest countries that we serve. Our annual investment volume in PSW countries almost doubled, right? From around, I think it's around 600 million to close to $2 billion per year, which is good. I mean, which is good. Is that going to change is that going to move the needle? Is that going to address, given the increasing number of fragile situations that we find ourselves in? It's good, but it's clearly not enough, right? Why has it been as challenging as it has been? My esteemed colleague, earlier today, she is the IFC's director for fragile and conflict situations. She emphasized that IFC's projects in IFC supported projects in FCS markets take 3 times as long to do and are 3 times smaller than the average IFC projects. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and it takes a long time, and it requires persistence, and that is sometimes not something that we are the best at, but we're trying to get the better at. And then 3, non-financial risks. We are, although we say, and we have made some strides in trying to recognize that we cannot expect companies in these markets to meet the same standards that we would apply to companies in more developed markets. We still, saying that and living it are 2 different things, I think. And I think we still have a ways to go on that front.
One sentence, is the portfolio, you started out with your projects in Afghanistan and elsewhere, is the portfolio of IFC in fragile states profitable?
I honestly do not, I do not have the current data on the profitability in fragile states. What I can tell you is historically, and not just because of the deals that I did, but historically in large part because of the sectors that we invested in. So because we did a lot of investments in the telecom sector and in the mining sector in fragile states, those tended to do very well. But those projects have matured. So our current vintage of projects in FCV markets, I don't know what their returns are. I can say that today, the portfolio for projects where IFC uses the private sector window, the returns are lower than comparable projects where IFC does not use blended finance. So, no, we are not making IFC. I don't want to leave you with the impression that all projects in FCV contexts are highly profitable. They're not, right? Even after giving effect to the subsidization, they are not highly profitable. Again, the idea is that over time, however, you're building a sustainable business model that can provide commercial returns.
So I think that's a really good segue to Bart. Bart, can you tell us first very briefly about what you do?
Yeah.
Give us a sense of the answers that that Aisha was just talking about, not just the difficulty in the environment, but also to what extent you can actually do business there. A sense of what impact you have, because one issue in this whole debate is there's always a bit of skepticism whether in fragile and conflict settings intervention with the private sector is actually helpful or harmful. Those debates. So give us a little bit of sense of your business in this.
Yeah. So with XML, we started in DRC and Central African Republic. We then moved to Uganda, Angola last year, and we're moving into Zambia and a little bit of Kenya. So it's really sub-Saharan Africa, a band from west to east. We focus on investing in SMEs, so small, medium-sized businesses. We started in 2010. We've raised 4 funds. 2010, 16, 20, 24. Now we're hopefully closing the 4th one this week. So I'm a bit thrilled about the situation we're in, including a pocket from IDA, which is the first time, because the first 3 funds were not blended. They were clean, mostly DRI money, some private investors. And what we do with these investments in SMEs, it's growth capital. So it's cross-sector. It goes from hospitals, healthcare, to retail, to manufacturing, some telecom-related business, quite a bit of services. And we focus more on, let's say, agglomeration. So Kinshasa as a city is sort of our hometown. So is Kampala, Luanda, same thing. And there are reasons why we do that, because we've had a number of learnings, which goes back to fragility. And what we also mentioned in the discussion before is that fragile or conflict, it's an overall definition, but it's very different from, let's say, Eastern DRC to being in Western DRC, where it's a much more normal situation. If you then look at companies we invested in and what we have achieved, it's really about creating jobs and more sustainable businesses. You can't raise 3 or 4 funds if you haven't given money back to your investors. So that's a very important component to make this model sustainable. You can only do that by being sometimes quite hardballed. It's not concessional. It's not about giving grants. It's really, you want to find the right entrepreneurs, the best in class in those markets that would be very successful entrepreneurs in the US or wherever in the world, because there's very common denominators among successful entrepreneurs. And you help those with an existing business to then grow. And we've chosen for a model where we do that with quite a bit of debt and sometimes equity stakes. There's been a long discussion also with the DFIs fine-tuning what is the approach to investing in the funds we have or other colleagues who are fund managers elsewhere. What we have seen in the last 15 years in Africa is that there's been a fair amount still in equity funds. We think that for this particular segment, it's much better to be close to an entrepreneur with debt, because you can also return then quicker money and make your own business more sustainable, and therefore you get more money in, and that leads to one of the things that's a hot topic is how can we get more money, more sustainable into these markets. If I look at results, probably across the portfolio, so just some numbers. If I include Fund 4, we've raised 250 million. The first fund was a $90 million fund. You won't see that these days anymore because it's too subscale. It's very hard to build a model from that. So now you see typically first-time funds that are bigger. We have offices in each of these markets because, as Aisha was saying, it's very important to be very close to those entrepreneurs and really help them. It's not just about money. It's about, the technical assist is a popular term, but it's at the end of the day, how can you help someone get an ISO certification? How can you help them with ESG? How can you get them in terms of certain standards so they can scale their business? And with that, you can help them and continue investing with them. And then you look at some other numbers. If I look at, for example, healthcare clinic in Kinshasa, we started with a small hospital, which was an emergency clinic, the only ambulance in DRC, or in Kinshasa at least. The doctors came to us. We made a relatively small investment, overall $500,000 in the beginning with Fund 1. With subsequent funds we invested. It's now a business or a hospital that's doing about 8 million, so it's been grown 25-fold. On the cash side, much better. But more importantly, if you look at the impact it also has locally on the quality of service, heart surgery that's been performed for the first time a few years ago in DRC. Again, better quality, and that's what you see across the board in whether it's a hospital, there's 2 other ones we have in Uganda, or whether it's transport or other types of business. It's really about, indeed, you can't get the same standards across the board, but what you can do is to really help those entrepreneurs that are really the right ones. If you pick the right ones, they're willing to work with you. And we've seen examples yesterday in one of the other panels where there were a couple of local entrepreneurs, one from Haiti. There's an enormous drive. It's really about helping them to thrive, and with that you grow yourself.
So with a very hands-on approach, being on the ground, helping your clients, you can develop a profitable portfolio of businesses in very complex environments. That's essentially what you're saying. What more is needed? What can the DFIs do to help you grow, to help others grow? Do they have the right instruments? So you say for the first time you're blending, so you felt that was useful. What else?
Yeah, I need to make one caveat from what I said earlier. We also spent 5-6 years in Central African Republic, which for us, and we talked about, you need to be more surgical about what is needed in which market or which part of a country, because not everything is as fragile or conflict related. I mentioned Eastern DRC, or the Northeast is very different from Katanga in the Southeast. Bangui is a different story. We pulled back because we thought we can't sustain a business there. And with that, we could put in trouble our whole model. So there you have to be also doing your learnings and then say, well, we need to move out or in, depending on the situation. If I look at indeed DFIs, what they can do, I think we've been lucky, but also in a good relationship with IFC with the last 4 funds. Without IFC, this would not have happened. There's a particular program, SME Ventures, which, if you look at the overall results, I don't think they were great, but they did seed a number of fund managers in these very difficult markets, including us, because I would not have thought 15, 20 years ago that they would be operating in DRC and Central African Republic and these other markets now, but that did happen. And so there's that, and then there's an element of what is needed more, I think, is be selective with who you select, with who you, like we need to be very selective with our clients. Who do we filter through and provide money to? I think with DFIs there's been a bit of a slower learning curve, and these funds are 10, 12, sometimes 15 years before everything is rounded up. But I think there's room to start be better in filtering, and like in the commercial sector in general, what is your product market combination? Is the product that as a fund manager you have, and as an investor in that fund manager, is that apt for the local environment? Are you doing it in the right way? And that goes back to, like what you always do, it's human resources. Who is the person across the table from you? Is that someone, or is that team capable of pulling through when you're also in difficult situations? We have a number of recoveries where loans don't go well, and then you go through the full 8 years in DRC that it may take through the courts. There's a court system, but it's slow. It's not optimal, but you can get your money back.
Great, thanks. It was a really interesting story. Now with Jean-François, does that resonate? So your story. And let me add sort of one dimension. Nancy started out and pointing to work that DFIs, MDBs, World Bank and IFC, Inter-American Development Bank and IDB Invest or others can do together in order to improve the environment for the private sector to invest in. So do you see when you talk about your experience now, can you sort of take that into account as well? To what extent it's not just the funding relationship with IFC or others, but also the broader relationship around the context in which you invest?
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you for having me this afternoon. So can I take a step back to sort of talk about Bamboo and what we're doing in Haiti? So Bamboo is an impact asset manager. And in Haiti, we co-manage a access to electricity fund since 2019. Just one correction from your introduction earlier. OGEF, the Off-Grid Electricity Fund, is actually a World Bank fund. So same family, but not IFC funded. Small difference, but big difference. And what is interesting about this fund is that it's a 10-year World Bank project, which I understand is very atypical. It's a grant to the government of Haiti channeling funding to the private sector to develop the off-grid electricity market. So you have all that interaction between the private sector-oriented fund manager, World Bank institutional organization, and public sector Haitian, not even Ministry of Finance, but Ministry of Public Works. So it is an institutional setup that is, I dare say, unique, right, in terms of fund management. So our mandate is to invest in off-grid electricity companies in the country and help them reach 200,000 connections, so households and small businesses, in 2028. So far, we've made 8 investments. We've developed 2 grant programs, and our investees and grantees have quietly electrified 70,000 households and businesses, despite the difficult environment, right? And so the question, so I'm a bit thrown off about the question is about what can the World Bank continue to do?
Do you get the support that you need? What is your experience simply with the not just the funding, but the work in the broader environment? Well, and if I get back to what Aisha and Nancy both were saying, actually, if you look at the upstream work in the off-grid area, so the obvious one is to enable to get the regulatory permits to do that and to have that kind of setup. Does that play a role in what you do?
It plays a major role. The World Bank has financed the regulator. They do finance they do support, and IDB, USA, they all support the technical team of the Ministry of Public Works to go forward with the national electrification strategy, including the off-grid electrification strategy. And so there is a strong support by this DFI community of the government of Haiti on their institutional reforms and their strategic attempts. What I would say has been more helpful on the DFI front in terms of supporting enabling environment has been a series of programs by USAID and Get Invest that basically fund investment banking services for local SMEs, right? So I think I can echo what Aisha and Bartut were saying, that there's a need to be deeply involved with these investees from the onset, and this is what these programs do, right? So there's the Invest platform that, thanks to them, we've been able to do 5 transactions, right? Get Invest is working on another transaction, and they're called transaction advisors, but they just take the hands of the SMEs, the entrepreneurs, and walk them through what it is to raise funds from first-time institutional funding, right? And so they work with on business plans. They work on financial modeling, negotiating term sheets up to closings. And so those have been extremely impactful in our experience, because they've shortened by a matter of, if not 6 months to a year, shaved off the cycle of investing.
Very good. Great. Just to close the loop, Nancy, so we've heard about that finance is important, of course. Blended finance can be useful, but we've also heard about the other elements of international cooperation that in complex settings can be very useful. And you had started out with that. So from your research now, but also from your experience in the past, is that do you see this coming together? Is the development finance community becoming more systematic about this?
Well, I'll draw more on my experience on the investor side than on the research side on this. First, in the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which builds large-scale infrastructure projects, mostly in Africa, and then I was head of something called the IDB Lab. I would say that the answer to your question is unfortunately no. And I think this conversation is converging on sort of the lessons that I very much agree with. So I would say, first of all, a lot of investment in project development, as Aisha was pointing out, choosing the right, I'm talking particularly about large infrastructure projects, doing a lot of analysis on what actually are the most growth promoting projects, and then doing a bunch of pre-feasibility and feasibility studies about what exactly to build and how to build it. There is just a shortage of finance to do all of that. So it's the good project development finance. And then there's the early stage investment, sort of the pre-operational, pre-profitability stage, which there's still a shortage of that. And then I would say particularly our experience at the IDB Lab, where we were very focused on innovation, there's a shortage of finance to pursue the kinds of innovation that work in low-income environments. So the business models in advanced countries don't necessarily, and technologies don't necessarily work in low-income environments. So you need a source of finance for innovation. So you need venture capital, you need early stage investors, angel investors, and those kinds of things are underdeveloped. So I would say that in addition to the risk sharing, there needs to be this kind of investment in developing the right projects, in early stage finance, pre-profitability, and in financing innovation. And then the risk sharing can address what is probably the biggest risk for most large-scale investments, which is the actions of governments, either the actions of governments which are harmful or inaction. So either poor regulation or failure by utilities to pay for power purchases. So I would say that the business models of the MDBs have to change to offer that more of that kind of finance. And I would say we have to be clear that that kind of finance is not necessarily profitable. So this is something that the shareholders have to understand, that if you want the MDBs to move into where there are actually capital market gaps, you are asking the MDBs to move into riskier activities which aren't necessarily going to be as profitable and which aren't going to necessarily earn as much in retained earnings, which can then add to equity, which can then expand operations. So I don't think that recognition, I don't think shareholders have really faced up enough to that reality. But I think all of what we've said here points the MDBs in that direction if they want to have more impact.
Thanks very much, Nancy. And I would ask Jean-François, Bart, Aisha to keep this in mind, and maybe you want to react at the end, because I think Nancy has thrown a really nice gauntlet here to us to see how we deal with it. But first I would like to turn to the floor. So we have two types of floor. We have the physical floor, and we have an online floor. And let's start with the room. Have we triggered enough questions? Let me start over there. There's a gentleman. Somebody's going to come with a microphone.
Hi, thanks a lot. My name is David Bridgman. The time when Aisha was in IFC finding new ways for invest, IFC was focusing more on advisory work. And just to tie in with Nancy's experience, I led our investment climate advisory work in Africa for a decade then. And your experience of the reforms happen with conflict-affected countries leaving conflict was very strongly our case. We weren't giving pots of money. We were just giving a little bit of advice, and there was no big grant coming alongside, but we had huge reform activities. And the reason we felt was because at that time, firstly, the one thing everyone in the country could agree with was the status quo is unacceptable. We need to change. So the argument for reform for economy-wide reform was very easy to make. And secondly, the vested interests were all flat on their backs at that stage. So it would later on, once they get into a more fragile situation, but not so conflict affected, you found the vested interests were able to stand their ground again and be able to push back against reform. So just to echo, that was very much the experience that we had at the time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Very good.
I just want to make sure that I understood something correctly. A very pertinent comment that Aisha made, that in 2018, the corporation made a major decision in line with its capital injection to channel more of its investment to FSV markets. And if I understood correctly, the target is 40% of IFC's investment?
It's 40. The target is 40% of IFC's annual own account investment, long-term finance in IDA countries by 2023.
And that's something that I fully support and continue to work very hard with.
Sorry, 2030, sorry. 2030.
But I guess the question, we also heard that the projects, and this has been, I think, all of ours experience, when working with in such markets, they take 3 times as long. They are 3 times smaller, and they're unprofitable or less profitable. So how do we reach that scale between now and the target date? And are there other metrics that we're looking at? Not so much the volume, but the impact and the number of projects which are being done. And this is something, I've been part of something called Local Champions Initiative, and this is a focus that we have really taken online in our work, primarily in the Sahel. Thanks.
Thank you. And we will have Aisha responding. Yeah, maybe we can take another question first. Just on a footnote, this was for IDA. The 40% is for IDA countries, not fragile and conflict states. Fragile and conflict states, the commitment is 15 to 20% of the total, I think is correct. It's still a very large increase, yeah. Please.
Thank you.
And you want to present yourself?
Yeah, of course. Isa Subian, I'm FCDO based in Chad. Thank you to all the panelists. I just had a question because I think in all the private sector sessions, I've heard a lot of really positive things about focusing on the small, medium-sized enterprises in FCV countries, as well as working more directly with local interlocutors. But I find that in country, it's not quite looking, at least in Chad, it's not actually looking like that. I know that there's a lack of local interlocutors to work with as well, but we've had conversations where there were some or certain DFIs who were considering financing a very large multinational in a livestock sector, and when you spoke about like responsible financing and investment, and this was like a sector that is very much linked to Fragility's livestock and herders and in Chad. So just wanting to understand better what that side of things outside of this 40%. So is this still going to be the remainder to kind of these larger multinationals, and to what extent are you really analyzing, I'm kind of looking at you, but to everyone, are you really analyzing the kind of work these multinationals are doing in FCVs and what risks that brings to Fragilities? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good questions. But I would like to hear also Barthoud and Jean-François about this, just sort of the feasibility on the ground to actually grow businesses with a lack of when there's a lack of capacity like this. Is there any other question before we go back to the panel? Shall we take the gentleman in the back?
Richard America, Georgetown University School of Business. I've been doing a consulting project in Lualaba province in the DRC, where copper and cobalt comes from. The question is about the quality of management in that country and every other country we're concerned about. If George Soros or Bill Gates came to you and said, I want to put $1 billion into Africa in a new way, I would say invest in good business schools and engineering schools. That would be top of the list, even though it seems counterintuitive. How would that help the poorest people? It would. But what is your thought on that?
Great, thanks. It's a very good question. Shall we, if there's no other question from the floor right now, Rebecca, do we have questions online? Are we good?
Let's take those, yeah.
Yeah, then let's take those questions. Shall we start with Aisha?
Sure. Let me start with the question that the gentleman asked about how in the world we're supposed to meet our targets. How in the world we're supposed to meet our commitments. This is something that keeps us all up at night. The reality is that, so to Hans-Peter's question, do we make, is our portfolio or our investments in FCS and IDA countries as profitable as our investments, let's say, in middle income countries? I don't have the numbers on the hand, but my assumption is that they are not. My assumption is that on a whole, they are not. What we have agreed with our shareholders is because we are a global institution, there is a recognition that we have something called the portfolio approach, but it's essentially a recognition that it's okay if we do not earn the same returns in both segments of our business, provided that as a whole, IFC's mandate is to be a commercially sustainable enterprise, right? So just to be clear, there's a recognition there. We understand that there is a higher cost associated with doing business in many of these markets, and it's a cost we're willing to accept because it's our mandate. And it goes to your second question, which is what are the targets we're looking at? The 40% target that I cited is one of the targets that we have, right? And it's a volume target. We have there's been quite a large effort for the entire World Bank group to move away from or to incorporate, in addition to those volume targets, impact targets. What is the quality? Our objective isn't to support a private company for the sake of supporting a private company. Our objective is to support a private company in the hopes that leads to that helps the economic development of the country. So what are the other metrics in place that we can use to evaluate whether or not we are achieving that outcome? And we have a new corporate scorecard in place, though, which is supposed to help us go in that direction. But there's a recognition. It's the impact metrics are equally as important as the volume metrics. So that's first. To your question about local champions, yeah, I will actually turn that over to my colleagues who work with local companies all the time.
Partially, I don't have. I understand the percentages. I don't know what that means in dollar terms. So I'm not going there, and I'm not with IFC, so I just don't know. I'm assuming it's a lot. Let me give you my 5 cents on what we see we could do in the market if there was unlimited funds. We grew from a $90 million fund, of which probably 15 million was invested. No, 17 or so was invested in DRC. The bulk of it, to then 55 million. Again, probably 60% of that DRC, so that gives you another 30, 40 million. Then an $85 million fund. Again, a lift, but it's every time it's a lift of, let's say, 50% more that you do in that market and in the markets that we have been operating in. So our expansion model is we can't do one fund of 150 million in DRC because there's not enough pickup in our segment. If you would ask me, is there room for 2 or 3 other fund managers like ourselves to do the same job? I would say that's going to really lead to deterioration of returns. People are going to chase a lot of deals, and you have the banking sector as well, who are, it's relatively small, but they of course do financing, and we don't think it's the right way they do it because it needs to be more longer term, more cash flow focused, etc. But anyway, they're there too. So is it a shallow market? Yes. Is Uganda relatively shallow? Maybe a little bit less than DRC. You can go on and on for each of these markets. They need time to develop. Therefore, if you have 500 million and you would tell me tomorrow, please, can you take it? I would say no, because we can't do it without jeopardizing quality. So that gives you a bit of a sense of, at least from our perspective as an SME fund manager, on what we think we can do on a sustainable basis. And then you need to look at, indeed, other metrics like what are the number of jobs created that are going to be there not next year, but also 5 years from now, because they're in the right businesses. Do those employees have healthcare? Do they have other things that help their family? Because it goes wider than that. And I think that's more of a halo effect, that with this, it's more about doing quality investments, and over time that lifts up a population longer term.
Thank you, Barthold. We're sort of coming to the top of the hour, therefore, just quickly, maybe Jean-François, if you want to just react briefly, including to the question of whether there shouldn't be much more investment in management quality. Anything else you want to add?
I'd rather answer that question than the others, because Barthold actually laid it out perfectly. I have no notes on what was just laid out. On the management quality, I work specifically in Haiti, and one of the aspects of this market has been that there has been a tremendous loss of human capital over the last 20 years, but even more over the last 2 years, where low end 1.5% of the population emigrated from the country, and probably among the best that we had left, right? And so definitely investments in education, in business education, and science-based professions is necessary. But at the same time, companies exist and are trying to do their job, so we accompany them as much as we can, and we introduce them to potential consultants. We step in when we have to step in terms of working out some models, working out some thinking through strategic options with them. So 100% on the educational front.
Thank you, Jean-François. But you had one other
Just
observation.
really quickly on the DRC education question. I had noted down in my notes human resources.
Yeah.
It's all about that, and better education, whether it's business, vocational. We have mechanics we know companies with mechanics, and you look at an engine and it comes out with a piston sticking out of the engine because they don't know how to do really basic stuff. That's not on the business side, but it's really vocational basic stuff. There's a lot more need for that. So I agree. And that also goes back to how much can you invest then? Because if you have a wider base of better entrepreneurs, you can invest more.
Low capacity environments in many ways, which is almost by definition what we're talking about, right? And Nancy, 2 sentences?
I think it's useful to think about it in terms of how you define success for a given multilateral development bank in a given country. And it's just extremely hard to transform an entire economy and to affect macroeconomic variables like growth and poverty reduction. So it seems to me the institutions need to start thinking about how to set priorities in a country in concert with governments, and then combine all of their tools to achieve sort of deep transformation in a given sector or sectors. And then you can bring together the policies, the institutional reforms, the early stage finance, the project development, the risk sharing. You can do a lot more of the sort of subordinated products that actually mobilize more capital. So you're not just worried about your own account investment, but everybody else's investment. And you could actually measure success by transformation in those sectors. And you can integrate climate into the sectors you choose and how you invest in those sectors. And I'm very influenced by my experience in the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which does essentially that. Millennium Challenge Corporation compacts in large countries are $500, $600, $700 million, not $1 billion. But so Millennium Challenge Corporation spends a lot of time working with the country to set sectoral priorities, and I think the institutions have to do more of that.
Thank you very much. I think, panel, you have answered the questions you were given. We have gotten a much more vivid picture of what's going on. So what I'm taking from this is the focus is, yes, finance, but even more everything else that comes along, which helps develop projects. The importance of a concerted approach, I think what Nancy now said at the end. What I'm taking from it as well is that this is a very, very challenging goal that IFC has set itself, others have set themselves, which is going to demand a lot of attention. I personally feel that we need to translate the World Bank Group strategy process, which rightly highlights fragility as a major topic, translate that a bit more into concrete practical implications for how the World Bank Group would work and other institutions. So, but I think it was also somewhat a hopeful message, because we actually have private sector that is functioning. We have investments that are not, total losses. This is business. Business is possible in these environments. And if you look across the fragile conflict settings, in the end, that's what will have to grow if we want to get anywhere with these countries, if we want to end up lowering the potential for fragility and conflict. But we need a holistic approach to that on the part of the development community. Thank you very much, panel. We're going to give you a big hand.